When I bought the land out by Maple Cove, I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for quiet, somewhere between peaceful and no cell signal. The property came with 40 acres of trees, a winding creek, and tucked behind a hill an old wooden bridge that creaked like it had seen the Civil War. But it was mine. My plan was simple: patch up the bridge, park my camper by the creek, and spend my weekends pretending emails didn't exist. The realtor, a cheerful woman who wore sunglasses indoors, mentioned something about adjacent commercial interest. I nodded politely and ignored it. Adjacent sounded like not my problem. For the first 6 months, life was bliss. I'd wake up to birds, make coffee over a campfire, and cross that rickety bridge to the old trail that led into town. It wasn't pretty, but it was freedom. Then, one Friday afternoon, I returned from town with groceries and saw it. My bridge, gone. Vanished. Just two muddy banks staring at each other like they'd had a bad breakup. I parked, stepped out, and stared at the wreckage. The boards weren't just missing, they'd been sawed clean, like someone had decided, let's erase history today. A tall man in a fluorescent vest waved from the far side of the creek. "You can't cross there," he yelled. "Apparently," I said, gesturing at the absence of bridge. "Where's my bridge?" He pointed toward a hill where a line of earth movers rumbled like dinosaurs. "New development, Maple Cove Lakeside Resort. We're putting in the access road today." I blinked. Access road? That was my bridge. He shrugged, the universal gesture for not my problem. 10 minutes later, I was on the phone with their project manager, a man named Brad who sounded like he kept his sunglasses on even when sleeping. "Look, buddy," Brad said. "That bridge was condemned. Unsafe. Liability nightmare. We're actually doing you a favor." "Did you buy my land without telling me?" I asked. "No, but we're accessing the area under the shared maintenance easement. Totally legal." I could practically hear him smirking through the line. That night, I camped by the creek with a flashlight and a notepad. "Shared maintenance easement," I muttered. I dug out my folder of deeds and plats, the ones I'd never bothered reading because, honestly, who does? By 2 a.m., I was wide awake and grinning. The so-called easement? It was a revocable courtesy access, granted by the prior owner for agricultural use only. Their bulldozers? Trespassing. The next morning I drove into town and paid the courthouse clerk for certified copies of my property documents. She raised an eyebrow when she saw the map. "Oh, that old tract? That's the one that controls the water rights for the lower basin." "Water rights?" I repeated slowly. "Yep," she said, stamping the papers. "Whoever owns this section can divert or restrict the flow through the reservoir. Old law. Never got updated when the resort land changed hands." I smiled like I'd just been handed the keys to a very specific kingdom. By Monday, I'd traded my camp chair for an attorney. Mark, my lawyer, was the kind of guy who lived for paperwork wars. He read through the documents twice and then looked up with a grin. "Technically," he said, "you own the bridge site, the creek crossing, and the inlet valve that feeds the resort's private lake." "Their lake," I said slowly, "depends on my creek?" "Exactly." I glanced out his office window at the sparkling Maple Cove billboard across the street. The tagline said, "Where serenity meets luxury." "Serenity's about to meet paperwork," I muttered. A week later, the resort sent me a formal notice claiming mutual access rights. My response was a polite, notarized cease and desist. I might have also taped a laminated copy of my deed to a stake at the former bridge site with a note that said, "Private property. Cross at your own legal peril." That's when the war began. Brad showed up at my campsite with 2 assistants wearing his best, "we're all reasonable adults" smile. "Look, man," he said, "we're happy to rebuild the bridge for you. In fact, we'll make it a modern concrete one. Call it an upgrade." "On my land?" I asked. "Well, technically, the resort owns the downstream." "No," I said, cutting him off. "Technically, I own the access to your lake." He blinked, processing. "Our lake?" "The one you just drained half your construction runoff into," I said. "Yeah, that one." They left 30 minutes later, muttering something about calling legal. For the next month, bulldozers roared day and night. They built the resort's pier, luxury cabanas, and private beach. I stayed quiet, kept mowing my patch of grass, and watched as they pumped more and more water from my creek into their man-made paradise. They were too busy laying tile and pouring cocktails to realize that every gallon depended on a century-old valve system located behind my cabin, the one I now had the key to. The Maple Cove Lakeside Resort opened with the kind of spectacle you could smell from miles away. Literally, smoke from the grand opening fireworks drifted over my trees like confetti made of regret. The road they'd built curved just outside my property line, a ribbon of concrete that looked suspiciously like it wanted to creep onto my land. I stood at the edge of my creek, coffee in hand, and watched the first shuttle buses arrive, packed with guests in sun hats and brand new flip-flops. By noon, a jazz band was playing. The water level in their artificial lagoon glistened like liquid gold under the sun. And all I could think about was how that same water had just flowed through the small metal valve behind my cabin. A valve installed in 1953, rusted but still functional, connecting my creek to their private lake. The valve I'd unlocked that morning, just to see it work. A single twist, and the water pressure in the old pipe hissed to life. A second twist, and it stopped entirely. It was like holding the resort's heartbeat between my fingers. By the time the second weekend rolled around, the resort had hit full capacity. Brad's voice popped up on my voicemail one morning. "Hey, we might have a small flow issue from your section of the creek. Totally routine, just checking in." I didn't reply. Instead, I sent a short, formal email through my lawyer. "Please direct all inquiries about resource usage through proper legal channels." Mark, my lawyer, thought I was being too nice. "You could literally charge them for every gallon they've used since they broke your bridge," he said. "I'm saving that for dessert," I replied. The next week, resort guests started noticing the water level drop. Social media posts popped up. "Why's the lake so shallow?" "Floating docks tilting." It was subtle at first, just a few inches, but as the days passed, the drop became visible from the road. The resort crew scrambled, pumps humming, sprinklers switched off, landscaping trucks rushing in with water tanks. Then came the rainstorm. A freak summer downpour hammered the hills for 2 solid days. The creek swelled, and runoff poured straight toward the resort. But because their engineers had rerouted natural drainage to build the resort's access road, cutting through what used to be my bridge path, the excess water couldn't escape properly. I watched from my porch as the newly paved drive turned into a shallow river. Mud flowed downhill like it had been waiting centuries for revenge. Brad showed up again, soaked to the bone and furious. "You have to open your valve," he shouted over the rain. "Why?" I yelled back. "Because our retaining wall's giving way. You're holding water." "I'm holding my creek," I corrected. "Big difference." He glared. "You're flooding us on purpose." I just raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you tell me you were doing me a favor when you tore down my bridge?" For a moment, even the rain seemed to pause. When the storm ended, the resort's beach looked like a swamp. Half the parking lot was submerged, and the fancy Serenity Suites were anything but serene. Their legal team sent me a notice of intent to claim emergency access rights to the valve. Mark framed it and hung it in his office. "Classic overreach," he said. "You want to have some fun?" He explained the next step like it was a game of chess. "We'll file an injunction confirming you as the legal controller of the water inlet. Then we issue them a use license, temporary, revocable, and priced at whatever you want per cubic foot." "Like a subscription service," I said. "Exactly. You're the Netflix of their lake." By now, the story had spread through the county. The man who owned the plug became local legend. Even the hardware store clerk winked when I came in for a new wrench. That weekend, the resort held an exclusive investor brunch to reassure their backers. Champagne, linen tablecloths, the works. I decided it was the perfect time for a field visit. I walked in wearing my old fishing hat and a flannel shirt. Security tried to stop me until I held up the deed. "Property owner," I said, smiling. "Just checking on the water supply." Brad's face went pale. "You can't be here." "Can't I? You're literally pumping from my land," I said, pointing toward the intake valve hidden behind their landscaping. You didn't think I'd notice you installed an auxiliary line? He stammered something about temporary fixes. I pulled out my phone and took a few photos. Cool, I'll send these to my lawyer. 2 hours later, I got an email from Mark. They want a meeting. Tomorrow morning, their board's flying in. I grinned. Finally. At the meeting, they offered me what they called a cooperative agreement. Translation: they wanted to buy rights to the creek for a one-time payment. Their offer? $25,000. Mark looked at me. I smiled. You tore down a bridge worth $3,000 and built a resort worth $4 million, I said. My water runs under all of it. You can do better. They upped it to $100,000, then $250,000. I pretended to think. You know what? I said. I don't want to sell. I just want control. Keep using it if you want, but every drop's going to cost rent. Mark slid the papers across the table. A hydrological use license agreement. $2 per cubic foot of flow. Estimated annual value, $500,000. Brad went pale again. That's extortion. No, I said. That's property management. The meeting ended with a lot of muttering and no signatures. But 2 days later, I got a certified envelope with their approval. The next morning, I walked down to the creek, tightened my wrench around the valve, and thought about all the noise, all the mess, and that missing old bridge. I smiled. Then I turned the valve one notch tighter, just enough to remind them who really ran the lake. By the end of summer, Maple Cove Resort was running like a beautiful disaster. The brochure promised crystal clear waterfront luxury, but guests were starting to joke online about the disappearing lake. Some mornings it looked full, others it dropped several inches overnight. They blamed evaporation, humidity, even climate change. I didn't correct them. Instead, I sat on my porch with coffee, watching the mist lift off the creek, and waited for the inevitable knock on my door. It came on a Wednesday morning, right after sunrise. Brad stood there, wearing a suit this time, flanked by a woman in business glasses and a man carrying a very serious briefcase. The look on his face said, "We're not here for coffee." "Morning," I said. "Water's running fine today. Want me to check the valve?" The woman spoke first. "Mr. Anders, I'm representing Maple Cove Development Group. We'd like to revisit the terms of your license agreement." I leaned against the doorframe. "Revisit meaning honor or ignore?" "Renegotiate," she said. Brad jumped in. "Look, man, this whole water thing, it's gotten out of hand. We're losing business. Guests are complaining, investors are..." "Regretting not reading the deed?" I offered. She sighed. "You're in a position of leverage, Mr. Anders. We'd prefer not to escalate this in court." I grinned. "Then don't." They left with promises of further communication, which in lawyer speak means see you in paperwork purgatory. Sure enough, 2 weeks later I received a thick envelope. Cease and desist order, civil summons, and something about malicious interference with commercial operations. Mark laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. "They really don't get it," he said. "You own the water source. They can't operate without your consent." "Yeah," I said, "but I don't want a war. I want a bridge." He looked up. "A bridge?" "Yeah, the one they tore down." Mark smiled slowly. "You want to trade the water for the bridge back?" "Exactly. But not just any bridge," I said. "I want it my way." We filed a counterclaim demanding damages for the destruction of private infrastructure, my bridge, and for trespassing, environmental impact, and unauthorized use of hydrological resources. It was a mouthful, but it translated to, "They owe me big time." The case didn't even make it to court. The resort's parent company called for mediation. Apparently, their water levels were now so unstable they couldn't keep the docks level. Guests had started slipping on tilted planks, and the insurance company was asking uncomfortable questions. The mediation was held at the county offices, neutral ground with terrible coffee and fluorescent lights. Their team arrived in suits and stress. Brad wasn't there this time, which was a shame. I was starting to enjoy watching him sweat. Their lawyer began with corporate politeness. Mr. Anders, Maple Cove would like to propose an amicable solution. We'll rebuild your bridge, modern, concrete, fully maintained, and compensate you for the temporary inconvenience. Sounds nice, I said. And my water rights? They exchanged looks. We'd like a long-term lease, the lawyer said carefully. 50 years renewable. Mark leaned back in his chair. 50 years at current market rate would exceed their property value. I smiled. Tell you what, I said. Keep your lake. Keep your resort. But I want the land around it, say, half an acre, where the bridge used to stand. Deed it over to me. They froze. That's part of the resort, the lawyer said. It was part of my property before your bulldozers got creative, I replied. I just want what was mine, legally and literally. They huddled, whispered, and eventually nodded. Fine, half an acre. In exchange, permanent water access. Mark smiled. And a rebuilt bridge. Done. 3 months later, construction trucks rolled back in, this time with my permission. They poured concrete, installed railings, and built a bridge sturdy enough to survive another century. I stood beside the foreman as they laid the final slab. Not bad, I said. Still misses the charm of the old one. He laughed. Concrete doesn't creak like wood. No, I said, smiling, but it holds. When it was done, the resort threw a thank you event to smooth things over publicly. Brad avoided eye contact the whole time. He looked about 10 years older. One of the investors approached me, an older woman with a sharp smile. You're the man who owns the water, right? She said. I nodded. She chuckled. Next time, we'll read the fine print. Smart idea, I said. For a few months, everything was peaceful. The resort's lake stayed full, the new bridge stood strong, and I got to enjoy my quiet weekends again. I even got a nice check every quarter, technically water management royalties. But peace never lasts long around Maple Cove. That winter, I noticed construction equipment again. New lights, new roads, and a suspicious sign. Future site of Maple Cove expansion, Phase 2. I drove down and saw Brad pacing near the site, phone pressed to his ear. He noticed me and hung up. Expansion, huh? I said. He looked tired. Corporate wants more cabins. Says we can double capacity. Did corporate forget the bridge and water rights come with conditions? He rubbed his temples. Look, man, I'm just trying to keep my job. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Tell corporate, I said, that before they start building Phase 2, they should check who owns the access easement on that side of the lake. He frowned. Who? I handed him a folded piece of paper. Freshly recorded deed transfer. Half an acre of land bordering their new expansion zone. The one they'd just agreed to deed over to me during the mediation. I gave him a little wave. Welcome to my side of the bridge. Brad stared at the deed in his hand like it was written in another language. You own this? He said finally. Half an acre, I replied. Right where your new road's supposed to go. Remember? Part of the settlement. He ran a hand through his hair. You're kidding me. I wish I were, I said, laughing. But paperwork's funny that way. You build a bridge, give away a little dirt, and suddenly the whole layout shifts. By the time his corporate office figured it out, construction had already started. They'd poured a slab that half-crossed my property line. The county inspector halted work until the issue was resolved. For 3 weeks, the resort's fancy expansion project sat frozen in the snow, crews paid to wait while executives argued over easement rights. Mark thought it was hilarious. You could rent them the land again, he said. Charge them for walking across it. Tempting, I admitted, but I'm getting tired of paperwork wars. So I called a meeting. Not at their office, not at mine, but on the bridge. The new one gleamed under winter sunlight, the creek below clear and steady. When Brad and the investors arrived, they looked cautious, like I might announce a toll booth. I'm not here to fight, I told them. You've got a business to run. I've got land I actually like. Maybe we stop pretending we're enemies. One of the investors leaned forward. What are you proposing? Partnership, I said. You use my water responsibly, and in return I get a slice of what you build. Not cash. Ownership. You want to double your cabins? Fine. Give me 10% equity, and I'll even manage the environmental side. Maintenance, creek preservation, local access. It's good PR for you and peace for me, they whispered among themselves. Brad gave me a look that was half disbelief, half relief. You'd actually work with us? As long as nobody touches my bridge again. The investors huddled for a moment, then one extended her hand. Deal. Mark drafted the paperwork that week. We called it the Maple Cove Cooperative Agreement. I kept my water rights, my half-acre, and a shiny new title, Environmental Consultant. It came with a quarterly dividend and, better yet, veto power on future expansion plans. By spring, the resort had bounced back stronger than ever. They marketed the new arrangement as a sustainability initiative, local stewardship, green water management, and other buzzwords that made everyone look virtuous. I didn't mind. Every brochure that mentioned our partnership with local landowner John Anders reminded guests whose creek kept their lake full. The best part? They rebuilt a little wooden walkway beside the concrete bridge, purely decorative, a nod to history. It even creaked a bit when you crossed. I walked it every morning with my coffee, listening to that old familiar sound and smiling at how things had turned out. Brad stopped by sometimes, usually when his stress level spiked. One afternoon, he leaned on the railing and shook his head. You know, when we tore down that bridge, I thought you were just a stubborn camper. I was, I said. Then you gave me a crash course in property law. He laughed. Fair enough. You ended up running part of the resort. Not bad for a guy with a wrench and a deed, I said. We stood there for a while, watching the sunlight ripple across the lake. The new cabins sparkled on the far shore, guests paddled kayaks, and the water flowed exactly the way it should, steady, balanced, shared. Guess everyone won in the end, Brad said. Yeah, I agreed, except the guy who built a bridge without asking. He laughed again, and for once it sounded genuine. Later that evening, I sat on my porch, coffee steaming in the cool air. Across the water, string lights glowed along the resort's pier. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted on the wind. I thought about how easy it had been to get angry at the start, to dig in, fight, prove a point. But the bridge, the water, even the resort had taught me something. Owning land doesn't mean owning peace. You build that yourself. So I raised my mug toward the lights and said quietly, Truce. The creek murmured in reply, content. For the first time since they'd torn down that old bridge, Maple Cove finally felt like home again, on both sides of the water.